Okay, this will help you with project 2. I'm going to show you how to make a CSS div tag structured website. We're going to start off by making a template page that we will base all our other pages on. And so I'm going to go ahead and walk you through this. The first thing I do is make a folder for my root folder on the desktop. This one I'm entitling movies to fit the project. If I look inside that folder, I have 2 more folders I made. I made a folder for images. I'll put some images in there. I made a folder for my CSS sheet, which I will put in there in a little bit. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is open Dreamweaver and connect to my root folder, to my site folder. I can do that a couple ways. One way is go through the menu here at the top, Site, New Site, give the site a name, Movies. I'm going to click this browser icon here to look for my root folder. There it is on the desktop. I'm going to double click, choose. Next, I'm going to go to the advanced settings. I'm selecting local info. Now I'm going to browse for my default images folder. If I click this browsing icon here, I should automatically go to my images folder. I can double click that, choose, save, and then OK. Now if I look at my files window, I see I'm connected to my site. Here's my CSS folder and my images folder. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is make a new blank template page. File, New, blank page, HTML template, none. There's some pre-made pages, but we're going to choose none for this project. Here's HTML5 and say create. Now I have a blank template here. The template will not actually be used as a published page for the internet. We will just use it to base our other pages upon. In the title here, I'm just going to call this Movies. And now I'm going to save this page. File, Save As. This template doesn't have any editable regions. That's okay. I'm going to title this file movies.dwt. That stands for Dreamweaver template. Dreamweaver automatically makes a template folder in your site folder to save the templates. So I'm going to say save. Now if I look over here in my files panel, in the templates folder, there's my template page that I'm working on here. Alright, now I'm going to start to build the structure of my web page. I'm going to click my cursor within here, and for this I'm going to use my insert panel. And the first structure I'm going to insert, I'm going to select structure and insert a div. The first thing we're going to do is make a box or a container that will hold all my other structure in place. This container will hold the header, nav bar, sidebar, main, content area, and the footer. So let me go ahead and create this. We're going to make this an ID. We're going to call it container. This is going to be a new CSS rule, and that will be saved as #container. That's how it'll be saved in the CSS code. Where do I want to save this? Choose where your rule will be defined. I don't want to define it in this document. I want to define it in a new CSS style sheet or a new style sheet file. Once I hit OK, it's going to take me over and let me save that new style sheet. So I'm going to say OK. It's going to let me save my style sheet and title it. I'm going to call this movies underscore style underscore sheet. Okay, where do I want to save this? Well, I want to save it right here in my CSS folder. I'm going to say save. Now this is bringing me back to my container rules, so I can define the rules or properties for my container. I can go to box section here to define the width and height. The width of this container is going to be 1024. There's several different default sizes of websites. We're going to make this one 1024 with a height of 768. I could make the height auto, which will let it stretch out longer as I add more content, but just to help us visualize it, we're going to keep it at 768 for now. We also want to use this container to center our website in the browser. We can do that by adding specific margins to the container. So down here in the margins section, we're going to deselect same for all. We're going to do a top margin of 0, right of auto, bottom of 0, left of auto. 0 auto, 0 auto. That setting will center the website or web page. Say OK. And OK. And now we see the rectangle structure of the container. Dreamweaver puts some default text here. I can highlight that and delete that. I don't need that. Okay, now I'm going to put in my header section. I want to make sure I'm still clicked in the container. I can click here and check down here on my pathway. We're in the body and we're in, yes, we are in the container still. So let me add my next div tag. It's going to be a header. In my insert panel, structure, insert panel, structure, header. I'm going to call this a header. It's a new CSS rule. It'll be saved as hashtag header. And I want this to go to movies style sheet, CSS. Say OK. Now I can define the properties of my header. I can go to box, make the width 1024. This is going to go all the way across. The height is up to you. I'm going to do 100 pixels. And for the rest of these boxes or div tags, we're going to float them left. So I want this to float left. I can also do a background color. I'm going to select a background color. I can always come back and change this later, but this may help me visualize the structure. Back to my box section, I could put a margin at the bottom if I wanted. That'll keep this header a little bit separate from my navigation bar. So I'm going to put a 10 pixel margin at the bottom of my header. And I'm going to say OK, and once again OK, and there's my header. There's the default text Dreamweaver puts in there. I can delete that. Now I'm ready to put it in my navigation bar. Well, it's a little bit tricky to position your cursor in the correct place. There's a couple ways to do that. One way is to select the boundary or the edge of your header. And if I look down here, my pathway, I'm in the body, container, and header. Then on my keyboard, I select my right arrow 2 times. I hit my right arrow 2 times on my keyboard. Now if I look back here, I'm back in my container and I can add my next section. My next section is going to be the nav bar or navigation bar. So here in my insert panel under structure, select navigation. And I'm going to make this an ID called nav, N-A-V. This is a new CSS rule. It'll be called #nav. It's going to the movies style sheet and say OK. I'm going to define the properties for the nav bar. In the box section for the width, I want this to go all the way across horizontally. I'm going to make it 1024. And for the height, there's no real right or wrong here. I'm going to stick with 50 for now. And I'm going to float this left. That will make the floating it left will make sure it pops down underneath the header. And I'm going to do a background color here just so you can visualize the nav bar a little easier. I'm going to say OK and OK. So there's my nav bar. There's some text there. I can delete that. Once again, next I would do my sidebar. I make my sidebar line up over here on the left. Once again, I could select the border of my nav bar, arrow twice on my keyboard, and add the sidebar. But let me show you another way to do that. I'll show you another way to do the same process. Let me go to the code side up here. Remember, we have the design view, the split view, and the code view. And if I look at my HTML code, there's my body tag. There's my div ID container, my container div tag, which gives me that big box that holds all the other sections in. Here's my header. Here's my navigation bar, HTML code. Now I can add my sidebar. I can click to the right of the HTML code for my nav bar. Click enter. There should be a blank line now, and I can insert my aside or my sidebar by clicking on the aside. I'm going to call this aside. It's an ID. It's a new rule. Making sure it's going to the movie style sheet. Okay. Define the width and height. There's no right or wrong here. I want mine to be about 150 pixels wide and a height of 568, so we have room for our footer. And this should float left. I'm also going to add a by clicking the background category, I'm going to find a background color. And say OK, and say OK. And you can see it adds my aside HTML code here. If I go back to the design side, it gave me that aside or sidebar. I can highlight that text and delete it. I'm going to select that aside. I could now enter my main content area or a content section. I can do that on the design side or back to the code side. From the design side, I can click that sidebar, make sure it says aside down here, arrow to the right twice on my keyboard. I'm back in the container. I'm going to input my a section here, and my ID, I'm going to call this content. It's a new CSS rule. It's going to the right place, movie style sheet. Say OK. For the box, I'm going to define this width. I already have a width of 150 for the side. I'm going to do a width of 874 and a height of 568. Even though this is on the right side, I can float it left. That way I'll align it up right with the aside box. Well, what if I want some space between the aside and that content area? What if I wanted a margin between them? Well, I'm going to put a margin on the left of my content area. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I'm putting a margin of 10 pixels. If I add a margin on the left or right, I have to take away from the width. So this will be 864 pixels instead of 874. I had to take away that 10 that I added to the margin. Once again, this is up to you. If you don't want a margin, you don't have to change those. I'm going to say OK and OK, and there's my main content area. I left the background white or clear. If I wanted to change that, I could select that content area. And I could come over here to my CSS designer panel. It says the content area selected. And I could come up here, either the layout, text, border, or background section. I can go to the background section up here and change that background color. I want it to be a light taupe color there. I could also, this is also where I would add a background image. If I had a background image to put in there, like a texture, this is also where I could add a background gradient if I wanted to. Okay, so now there's my content, sidebar, navbar, and then header. The last thing we're missing is our footer. Well, I'm going to do that on the code side this time, just so you can see how we did that again. Here's my container, header, navbar, aside, my content section. I'm going to click to the right of my content section and hit enter. And back to my insert structure, I'm going to enter a footer. This is an ID called footer. It's a new CSS rule. This will save it as #footer. It's going to the movie style sheet. Okay. I'm going to define the width. This width is going to go all the way across, so 1024. The height, I'm going to do a height of 40 for now. I want this to float left. I can do a background color. Say OK and OK. There's the code for that. Footer ID equals footer. We go to the design side. You can see now I have the footer here. I can highlight the default text and delete that. Well, let's preview this in the browser and see how it looks. It's going to tell me to save it. Yes. And there's the structure of my website. A very basic structure. We'll change things a little as we progress, but that's how I make that structure. Okay, we have that saved. Now I could position my cursor within any of these sections, add text, add images, videos, anything. So I've saved this. Let me double check. Save all. Just make sure it's saved. And then our next video we'll start to add some content and make some more changes to the look of these sections.